Hello, hello, hello. Is there anybody in there? Just not if you can hear me. Is there anybody? Hello, 8th grade, and welcome back to United States history and our discussion of slavery, specifically the abolition movement, specifically the black leaders of the abolitionist movement. So, the next lessons, we're going to spend some time talking about black leaders of the abolitionist movement, specifically Frederick Douglass, and then later on, Harriet Tubman. Okay? So I hope you are excited because these are two very important figures in American history and they are very inspiring. So, reminder, I do want you to take notes to these videos because, of course, as you know by now, I don't even have to say it, you remember so much more of what you write down than just what you listen to and just what you hear. And of course, I tend to talk fast. I don't want these videos to be too long, so if you need to pause the video at any time, by all means, go ahead and pause it. Alright, I'm going to get started. We are talking about the abolitionist movement. Remember, the abolitionist movement being the movement to legally end slavery, which is different from emancipation, right? Emancipation is you are being freed from slavery, but abolition is the legal movement. They're going to change the Constitution, which, as you know, it's quite hard to do. Now, let's talk about the black leaders of the abolitionist movement. First, white support was necessary for the movement, right? The movement would have failed without white support. There's a theme throughout all of history, and that theme is movements often need the support of those in power to make change. So what do I mean by that? Here's what I mean by that. The abolitionist movement worked in the end because the United States Congress and President Lincoln ended up signing the 13th Amendment into law. Those people who did the signing, those congressmen, those senators, the people in the state houses, they were 100% all white men. So at the end of the day, at this time, all the fountains of authority in the country came, unfortunately, just from white men. Therefore, the more white people that did support the abolition movement, the more likely it was going to be that these white senators, these white congressmen, and these white presidents, male presidents, I should say, were going to be convinced. They're saying, oh, look at this. Other wealthy white people are supporting this. Maybe it's not such a crazy idea. And at the end of the day, the only way it was going to become law is if it passes through Congress, which of course was controlled entirely and unfortunately by white men at this time. So you need the support of those in power, of the quote unquote man, so to speak, right? That's why the abolition movement and eventually the women's suffrage movement was a success. It's very good, of course, to have black people saying they want their freedom and they want slavery to end, and they want abolition. However, if they don't have the support of those in power, there's never going to be any change, right? The same thing is true later on for the women's suffrage movement. When women were fighting for the right to vote, and eventually got it in the early 1900s, they only got it because the white men who were in power at the time eventually came around, took them long enough, but to agreeing with these women and changing the law because they have the power. So for movements to be successful, you do need to convince those who hold power because often the people leading the movements don't have that much actual power. That's why they're leading the movements. Now you can make the argument that they do have that much power because these movements go on for so long and so long, and although none of these black people at the time are in government, their voices united are powerful and eventually changed the minds of white people. And yes, I would say that is true power. When I say power, I'm talking about more legal power, like the legal power that comes with being a United States senator or president, for example. So, common theme that yes, you need white support for the success of the movement because movements need the support of those in power to make change. And we talked about William Lord Garrison last time, but now, moving on to this. However, many free blacks felt that their stories and their activism would be more effective. They knew firsthand, after all, the evils of slavery, right? So it's fantastic that we have wealthy white men like William Lloyd Garrison, who's going out and starting the Liberator newspaper, and he's helping to convince other wealthy white elites that slavery is wrong. However, what's going to really move people, it's going to be slave testimonies, and that is testimonies from ex-slaves who were involved in the movement. So, many former slaves were involved in this. If you get people like Frederick Douglass, who was a former slave, and other former slaves, like Harriet Tubman, in front of a crowd, maybe at one of these Second Great Awakening evangelical meetings, and they are telling firsthand the horrors they experienced during slavery, folks, that primary first-hand account is of course going to move people more than William Lloyd Garrison, a white man, telling a second-hand account of the horrors, right? It's always more effective to hear it from the horse's mouth. You remember when we were studying the Holocaust, for example, and those videos you watched, the survivor testimony, okay? It's the same thing. It's much more powerful to hear it from them. So many former slaves got involved in the movement, the most famous of which was most likely Mr. Frederick Douglass, who was a former slave who was highly, highly educated. All right, highly educated. He was a brilliant writer, an extremely gifted orator, which means a public speaker. We're actually going to read one of his speeches later, okay? And he was also the publisher of the Northern Star, which was another abolitionist newspaper. So William Lloyd Garrison, he had the Liberator, but Frederick Douglass had the Northern Star, right? So multiple abolitionist newspapers. And he called his newspaper the Northern Star because the Northern Star is a real star that exists out there in the world, and it always kind of stays the same spot in the sky, whereas other stars move around it. I don't know the science behind that. You're going to have to ask Mr. Langston about that. But he called his paper the Northern Star because slaves would use the Northern Star when they fled their plantations, fled their masters, and they're trying to get north, first to the northern states and then to Canada, where they could be truly safe from the Fugitive Slave Act. Because you might recall, even when ex-slaves got to the north, in a state that freed slavery, they might not be totally out of the woods yet, because as we know, northern states still had to return runaway slaves, even though they freed them. Okay. Frederick Douglass, folks. Wonderful, wonderful figure in history. Now, he actually convinced many white people that slavery was wrong and that blacks deserved to be free because many white people had negative stereotypes about black people at this time. Remember how I talked about in the past how it was possible to be a white abolitionist, aka a white person who wants slavery to end, but still racist in the sense that yes, you might think slavery is horrible and inhumane and it shouldn't no one should be subjected to that. However, you still might not believe that blacks and whites are equal. So you might want slavery to end, but you might not want these people to have voting rights or to become United States citizens. Well, these people would see Frederick Douglass speak. And Frederick Douglass, again, brilliant orator, he was extremely educated. He spoke and wrote better than most people have ever seen in their lives. So you have these white people watching Frederick Douglass speak, and they're thinking, here is a well-educated, well-spoken black man. Perhaps my prejudices that blacks and whites aren't equal after all are wrong. And they think that because Frederick Douglass is a living, breathing example of just how equal the races are. Right? So that is the genius of Frederick Douglass and how he was able to help convince so many white people to become not only abolitionists, but to become for black equality as well. All right? Because again, most people who are saying that, blacks aren't equal to whites, they never really, in the North, they never really been around black people. They just hear stories and they're very prejudiced and they're believing these lies, right? Then they see Frederick Douglass and they're like, oh my gosh, I'm totally wrong. And we are totally equal. And in fact, Frederick Douglass is most likely better spoken and better educated than most northern white people. Okay, so let's move on. Frederick Douglass was born a slave. He was actually the son of his first white master. His white master had a relationship with his mother. Historians disagree on whether or not that relationship was consensual or not, but we've talked about this before with Thomas Jefferson, who fathered slaves. So Frederick Douglass, technically by that logic, is half white. However, at this time, if you have a drop of non-white blood, you were not considered white. In the same way, remember the Holocaust, because of the Nuremberg laws, if you had a little tiny bit of Jewish ancestry in your blood, you were considered fully Jewish. You were considered Jewish and not Aryan. In the same way, if you had a little bit of black blood in you, you were considered black, not white. Even though technically he was half white. So that just shows how horrible those laws were and how much they changed. Now, Douglass and other former slaves convinced whites on the evils of slavery through their testimonies and stories. He traveled the world preaching abolition. He didn't just travel the country, folks. He went overseas to Europe, he went to Canada, South America. This guy lived and breathed the movement and went all over, okay? All over for this. He was very serious about it. And again, it's his firsthand testimonies of growing up as a slave that are really going to convince a lot of people, and his well-spoken nature. Now, for example, Douglass was able to convince President Lincoln not only to allow black men to fight for the Union in the Civil War, but he eventually convinced Lincoln to allow black soldiers to become officers. This was a big contentious point during the Civil War. Many white people who, again, were anti-slavery because they could recognize that slavery is a horrible sin to commit on someone else, they still didn't want black people fighting in the army. They were worried about giving black people guns. They might try to overthrow the government. And who could blame them, after all? Look at what Nat Turner did. So still many abolitionists were against arming blacks, but Douglass was able to convince Lincoln that you needed to do this because the Civil War was becoming increasingly about slavery. And Douglass says you need to give black people a chance to fight and bleed for their freedom. His logic being, if white people see black men fighting and dying and bleeding for America on the battlefield, perhaps white people would think, look at this. These black people are truly American because they are fighting and dying and bleeding for America. And you know what? He's absolutely right. Allowing blacks to fight in the Union and segregated all black regiments, unfortunately, did convince many white people that, you know what? These black people perhaps do deserve equal rights. Frederick Douglass would also famously go on to recruit some of the very first all-black regiments. All right? So again, Frederick Douglass had the ear of President Lincoln. He actually went to the White House many times to speak with Lincoln one-on-one, and he was also one of the black leaders who eventually convinced Lincoln that colonizing free blacks in Africa or South America was not the best idea, right? So, and that is Frederick Douglass and Lincoln have a wonderful relationship. There are many books written on it. There's actually a great play that I saw back in the fall about their meetings. They met a total of 3 times in person and exchanged many, many letters. And Lincoln, although he was a man of his time and very imperfect and had his own prejudices, he truly listened to Frederick Douglass and by the end adopted many of the things that Douglass wanted. Okay. After the Civil War, Frederick Douglass would go on to be the first black man to serve in a high office in the U.S. government. He was the first black ambassador, for example. He was the ambassador to the Dominican Republic post-Civil War. So as you can see, very, very, very important figure in American history. I mean, many historians will say, without Frederick Douglass, perhaps Lincoln's views on black people would have stayed a little more in their time instead of progressing more. So very helpful for getting the ball rolling. Not just for the work he did, getting Lincoln to allow black men to fight in the Civil War. I know it sounds funny, right? At the start of the war, black soldiers were not allowed to fight for the North. But the whole reason for the war, in some people's eyes, was slavery. It's not until the very end that Douglass convinced Lincoln to allow black people to fight. Alright, ladies and gentlemen, that's all I have for you on Frederick Douglass. Here's what you're going to do now. You're going to read this quote. Whether we turn to the declarations of the past or to the professions of the present, the conduct of the nation seems equally hideous and revolting. America is false to the past, false to the present, and solemnly binds herself to be false to the future. Powerful, powerful quote. What is Douglass talking about here? Well, I'm not going to tell you. You're going to tell me. I will say this is part of a speech that he gave on the 4th of July, and look at some of the words he is using. He's basically calling America out. You're actually going to read excerpts from Frederick Douglass's 4th of July speech. You're also going to watch a video here that's part of the PBS series. And this is this part of the speech you're going to read from Frederick Douglass. It was a speech that was made in 1852 on the 4th of July, and Frederick Douglass was asked to give a speech, and the speech he gives is quite provocative and wonderful. This is not the whole speech, all right, but it is important, I think, we hear from these black abolitionist leaders in their own words. So, after this speech, there are some questions here. Now, I would like you to answer these questions, RIP format, okay? If you're worried about adding detail, cite from the speech. If you need to read it more than once, that's okay. The language is old. But keep in mind, it's the 4th of July, and Douglass is trying to point out something that America basically can't truly be America unless slavery ends. Alright? So watch that video, read this speech, and I will see you all later. Don't hesitate if you have any questions, folks. Goodbye.